Not since the Great Khan had swept out of the steppes of Mother Russia had the world known violence like the unleashed evil of the 20th century. When the monarchy of Russia was overthrown by an ill-informed and politically delusioned group known as the Bolsheviks, the true evil of male-led governments became apparent. Under the Russian dictator Lenin, women were forced into barracks and turned into prostitutes by government edict. Sex was a human right guaranteed by the new constitution of Russia. Therefore, the newly formed communist government would ensure that its female workers would surrender their bodies for the good of the proletariat and the state. Outraged citizen slaves forced a quick change in policy, but other, more grim horrors were to follow. Under his Secretary of Security, Beria, Lenin had tens of thousands put to death to ensure the political stability of his regime. When he died, an even more evil dictator took his place. Stalin was in truth the new man that the Communist Party said they would produce. Without honor, pity, or the slightest spark of humanity, Stalin began a pogrom that sent tens of millions to their deaths. Not to be outdone, post-WWI Germany produced a madman of nearly equal stature. The apparent object of his hatred was a relatively small ethnic group called Jews. Beginning with the beatings of Jewish citizens and the desecration of the Jewish houses of worship called synagogues, his army of thugs spread out from the borders of Germany to enslave Western Europe. As each country was engulfed by the Nazi horde, people of Jewish heritage were swept up to be transported to Eastern Europe for relocation. Men, women, children, and babes in arms were packed into suffocating boxcars without food or water for the long train ride across the breadth of Europe. When the survivors were released, they were quickly separated into groups suitable for temporary slave labor and those whom the regime considered useless. The unsuitable children, suckling babes, and pregnant women were immediately sent to public showers whose spigots spewed cyanide gas. When the screams of the helpless were silenced by the deadly gas, the tangled mass of corpses were forcibly cleaned with fire hoses of the excrement caused by their violent deaths and pried apart with wooden poles. Then the bodies were carried by wheelbarrow to a human crematoria that plumed the black ash of the regime's victims on the surrounding countryside 24 hours a day. When the underfed, overworked and brutalized workers' survivors became too weak or ill to work, they joined their brethren in the ovens. The renowned German efficiency was given full play as the group of undesirables to be subjected to administrative extinction was expanded to include Russian prisoners, gypsies, Slavs, Poles, Quakers, conscientious objectors, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, mentally ill and deficient citizens as well as subversives of all stripes, i.e., anyone whose political views were not Nazi in origin. The combined death toll from Herr Adolf Hitler's program of proactive eugenics was approximately 9 million individuals. Not to be outdone, Stalin engaged in his own program to thin the indigenous human population within his domain. Unlike the brutally efficient German Third Reich, he didn't have the resources to waste on the technology of death camps whose high-tech German-engineered crematoria efficiently reduced human problems to ash. Stalin's solution to unreliable ethnic groups was merely to starve and work them to death in place. Not only did this policy reduce administrative overhead, but it left no incriminating records for later generations to indict the murderers, as did the daily logs at the Nuremberg trials when Germany and Poland fell to Allied troops. Approximately 50 million people died from direct and indirect causes of the communist government's policies under Stalin's direction. In terms of total human deaths, Hitler was a mere dilettante in death by comparison. Hitler died by his own hand in his Berlin bunker surrounded by his Russian enemies. Hitler was insufficiently evil to survive, Stalin was not. Stalin died an old man's death surrounded by a picked group of mass murderers and utterly corrupt generals. As the century wore to a close, other masters of evil made their attempts to mar the pageant of human history by their infamous misdeeds. Mao Tse-tung in China either equaled or bettered Stalin's record, but history cannot be sure of the exact number of his emaciated and cowed victims. Entire provinces starved under the Cultural Revolution and were reduced to vast wastelands that were empty of people. Certainly over 10 million died under his infamous rule, but the total figures will never be known. Estimates by the United States State Department during the late 1990s put the figure at approximately 100 million people. All that survives of that evil time are a few court records of entire villages driven to cannibalism of the bourgeoisie by the local populace.